You look back before about 1983, 84, most counseling happened in the form of pastors, clergy, friends, family, priests, neighbors, right? That was who counseled us. That was where we went for counseling. And in large, suicide numbers were less, feelings of connectedness and social responsibilities were better, right? I'm not saying, everything was perfect. There was a lot of issues going on in our country at that time. My point is that you are who they're talking about it.
Right.
So first step, realize that in that moment, there's a grace on you. For whatever reason, they've chosen you to come to. Don't negate that grace or to be afraid of that and give way to fear. In that moment, you can start by saying, I'm not an expert in this, but I just want you to know I'm in your corner. I love you. No person will ever go wrong leading with too much grace. If you lead with too much advice, you'll go wrong 9 out of 10 times. But if you just go with curiosity, I would say the 2 key ingredients to initial conversations, curiosity and grace.
Hey everybody, welcome again to the Today Counts show. I am excited to welcome today Evan Owens, who is the founder, I think that's right, Evan, of REBOOT Recovery, as well as, did you author the Healing What's Hidden with your spouse, or what's the deal there?
Yeah. Yep. My wife, Dr. Jenny Owens, and I wrote the book together called Healing What's Hidden. And yeah, we did.
Yeah, somebody
founded. We done founded. I'm not sure what the words you're looking there. We did it.
My personal assistant and my executive assistant, same person, but takes care of both sides of me, knew about you. I think she was reading your book, and she said, you got to get these guys on a podcast. So I've been through your website, but I'm excited to hear you bring that out into the verbal world, the audio world, so that we could learn about that. Why don't we start this way? So what is REBOOT Recovery?
Yeah, so REBOOT Recovery is a nonprofit organization, and our vision is to mobilize the largest faith-based response to trauma and suicide that's ever been built. And we look at a time in our world where there simply aren't enough professional counselors to meet the demand. There's not going to be enough professional counselors to meet the demand, which means that peer-based solutions are the future of mental health care in our country. And so that's what we do. We equip everyday people, like many people listening to this, to lead trauma healing courses at their church or in their community or for their businesses or whatever. And all of our courses are peer-led, they're outcomes-driven, and they're faith-based. And so anybody can lead a course, and that's our mission. That's how we're mobilizing this amazing response.
Well, that's a fan. You've articulated that extremely well, but let's back up a little bit. Where did it come from? Obviously, it's the first creation in your imagination, but there was something even before that. What brought this about?
Yeah, well, my wife, she would have joined me today. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, we had a death in the family, and so she's not able to be here with us today. However, she is a doctor of occupational therapy, and her specialty is in traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress. And she was recruited away from Vanderbilt's, one of their rehab centers, to really establish one of the first of its kind brain injury clinics for the Department of Defense. And so we moved our families. I was leading a technology company at the time as the CEO. And
that's a good match, though. That's a good match.
Yeah. So she moved us up there to the Department of Defense, up to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, working for the Army. And, I think she especially quickly realized that there was a big gap. One, no one was approaching it through a lens of faith. Number two, there was nothing that was peer-led. Everything was top-down. And number three is everything that was top-down wasn't stopping the problem among our veterans, specifically at that time. And so we began with just inviting 2 dudes named Matt and a lady named Darlene into our living room, and began to have conversations about that intersection, really, where faith and trauma collide. And we did a lot of listening, very little talking. And then they brought some friends, and then we invited more people, and pretty soon we were off to the races. And I'll never forget, we were on our way to a meeting with some very high ups at Fort Campbell. They said they had heard about our program, and they said, what's the name of it? And, we said, it's called Evan and Jenny's House on Monday Nights. It doesn't have a brand name. And that was way back in 2011. And God's brought us so far since then, that's for sure.
That is neat. I wish Dr. Owens was here. Wish Jenny was here to speak with us. So you're going to have to speak on her behalf. How did she decide to get into this lane in the first place?
Yeah, so she actually always had an affinity towards the military, but brain injury actually is kind of an amazing story. Her dad was actually in a very, very, very terrible motorcycle accident and was in a brain injury rehabilitation center for a long time. And she, while being with him, was just constantly in conversation with many of his therapists. And that's when she said, "This is what I want to do." And that's when she began to specialize in brain injury, was way back then. So
Wow.
pretty incredible.
Wow. So how long have you guys been in existence?
So we started in our living room in 2010. We kind of became an official 501c3 in 2012. We led reboot courses, and then we traveled pretty much every weekend to go stand up other reboot groups in other cities around the country. We did that for almost 5 years. And then in 2016, we kind of hit a wall where we realized we weren't able to do anymore. We had maxed out. We were compassion fatigued. We were burned out. But we had, by this point, had literally thousands and thousands of conversations with people who had encountered all types of worst days of their lives, worst traumas you could think of. And so in 2016, we decided to go all in and do this full time. We went from dual income with no kids to 3 kids and no income.
Frankly, that sounds a lot like ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't recommend that for every marriage, to be honest with you.
Right.
But for us, it worked at the time. And we released our first official curriculum in 2016. And just, it blew up from a group in our house to about 150 cities around the country. And then in 2018, there was a mass shooting at a place called the Pulse nightclub near Orlando, Florida. We happened to have a military group down the street from it. And we were able to work with them some and have conversations about what we could do with a peer-led, faith-based approach to help our first responders. So we wrote a curriculum for that. We released that in 2018, and it also grew to about 150, 120 locations, something like that, pretty quickly. And then to kind of put a bow on it, in 2020 is really when everything changed for us. We were sitting in a Mexican restaurant, which, if you know me, there's about an 80% chance that I'm sitting in a Mexican restaurant. I said, it just stinks that COVID was you could tell COVID was gaining steam.
Wait, back up. You said Kentucky and you said Mexican food.
So Fort Campbell, Kentucky is near Nashville, Tennessee. A lot of people don't know that.
Okay. All right. Keep going.
Yeah. Well, and actually Fort Campbell, Kentucky is extremely diverse. Really? Military cities in general are ridiculously, diverse, as you might imagine.
That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead. You're sitting at the Mexican food. You're about to.
Well, and I just said it stinks that we're always coming to the party of we're always late, meaning trauma's already had a chance to metastasize and grow and start spilling into divorce and addiction and all these other issues. I said, what if we could just study all the data that we have and say, here's what not to do. If we could interview the 10,000 people by this point at that time, here's what they would say not to do. And we did that, and we got the information back, and we threw together this really terrible curriculum that was filmed on an iPhone. I designed it myself. We finished it in 4 days, start to finish, and just gave it to the world for free and said, hey, if COVID hits your household and you find yourself in crisis or in trauma and you don't know what to do, here's what not to do. Don't do these things instead. And wouldn't you know it, that low quality thing was the thing that kind of put us on the map nationally. Within a couple of days, it had thousands of downloads. We were getting phone calls from Health and Human Services. I had a chance to brief the White House. We were on the news talking about it all the time. And that led to us eventually writing a book, which led to us writing a curriculum called Trauma Reboot, which has exploded. We went from, a brand new curriculum to about 225 cities around the country. And we now have 20,000 people that have been through our courses in 11 countries and 3 languages. And we've just seen it explode, where I think people want to be a part of something. They're fed up maybe with just the status quo, and they want to do something different. And what better way than doing it with people who have lived through a similar experience to you, and the beauty of that. So that's us in a nutshell. That's how we got to here today to this podcast.
My sister is going to be very interested in this podcast. She is a psychiatric nurse practitioner.
Yeah.
And is very involved in this kind of stuff. Our family has been also affected by PTSD, if you like, military service and what have you. So, our ears are up and we're listening. So this has been like massive, very unusual growth. It sounds like to me.
It has.
Yeah. So my brain just got filled with like 10, 15, 20 more questions. So I'll try to pull them out one by one.
Sure.
Yeah. So our country, our country is obviously in a place where we're struggling with our identity. When George W. was in office, he had a faith-based initiative
Right.
and then I don't know what happened to that. I don't know if that's still around. I don't know if but I bet you do. You say you're being contacted by these different government agencies. How is that working? How is that working? I thought that was taboo right now.
Well, I'll say this: desperation is a good mother of invention,
Yeah.
and I think that we've reached a place where you look at, suicide, for example, a very dark subject, obviously, but it's what we talk about a lot. It's the second leading cause of death for ages 18 to 39. It's likely to become the leading cause of death based on trends. It's suicide's happening every 11 minutes in our country. It's a leading cause of death for veterans. It's we've gotten to a place in our churches even where sort of this, it's okay to have Jesus and a therapist has become almost the standard. Not that there's anything wrong with therapists. I love therapists. I love clinicians. My wife is one. So I love that. But also we've gotten to a point where we're almost so busy and so not able to be interrupted that basically what we're saying is we don't have time for your problems. Pay somebody to listen to your problems. And I think that we've gotten to a place as a culture where the only time we can actually have somebody who truly listens to us is when we're paying them to do so. And the sadness and the loneliness that creates. We have a situation going on where there's, such a shortage rather of professional help that people are waiting 7, 8, 9 months sometimes just to be seen for an initial appointment. And so out of that, it's amazing to me that honestly, we're getting more traction right now than we did during, let's say, the Trump era. And the reason is that the situation has continued to escalate over the years, not because of politics, but at this point, politicians are basically, I think, at a point where they're saying, look, any and all solutions that work for certain segments of the population, let's entertain. And we've been very fortunate to be welcome. Now, absolutely, is our faith a hindrance sometimes? Absolutely. But what an opportunity to also be love and to be light in these communities and say, look, you may not believe everything I believe, but our mission to keep people alive is the same. We can meet at that. We can meet at that point. And what a beautiful conversation to have. And, we're just seeing these ridiculous doors open. We're working in prisons. We're working on death rows with inmates who are women who literally the only way you can be a woman on death row in a place like, for example, Alabama, is you had to have killed a child. And we're working in these places and we're seeing God go to them and say, no matter what you've done, you were never too short for the arm of the Lord to save. And what a beautiful message that is. Or we have a team that's in Ukraine that just got back and being on the front lines and working with families who have watched Russian soldiers come in. And it's very common that they will rape the women and the children after they take over a town. And to tell them, like, the anger you feel, the guilt, the shame, the grief, the sadness, those are all God-given emotions to help you heal. Don't deny those things. Don't feel like you're doubting God. Don't feel like you're sinning. Those are all God-given things that he gave you. Those negative emotions are gifts to use, tools to use. And I think just trauma is so common right now. And yes, it's trending in terms of a term, but it's also very, very common.
And very real. Yeah. So what is your core strategies? How do people become? What do you call them? Group leaders? Do you call them
peer leaders? Yeah, facilitators, peer leaders.
All right. So how do you find these people? How do they find you? How are they trained? How do people find the groups? How does that? What's that looking like?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for asking. So if anybody ever wants to go check out rebootrecovery.com, they can learn all about us. By the way, I should mention that. But Generically speaking, just so they know, all of our courses are 12 weeks long. They all welcome the spouse, partner, caregiver, whoever that person is, friend, family, support, to the course. Most locations provide meals and childcare to remove barriers to entry. And over a course of meeting one night per week for 12 weeks, they'll walk through one of our curriculums. We've got 3 different ones. One for veterans, one for first responders, and one for anyone who's gone through trauma. That's not audience specific, of course. And that third one. And the groups meet for about 2 hours per week. And a couple unique things is that from week 1, pretty much every participant is a leader in the group. And that doesn't mean that they're standing up and speaking every week. But what that means is, sometimes leadership is as simple as being the first one to show vulnerability. Sometimes it's the one getting there early and setting up chairs so that when people come in, it's a welcoming space. Sometimes it's staying late to check in on somebody you're worried about. I mean, those are all leadership things. And so from day one, there's this principle that you're going to live through it, you're going to learn from it, and you're going to lead other people. And so we believe that trauma healing, the goal of it is that trauma healing ends in empowerment. You know that you've overcome trauma successfully when you realize that other people are hurting and you now have the capacity to actually do something about it. And that's the final destination. And we don't rush you there. We don't expect you to necessarily get there fully in 12 weeks, but that's the ultimate destination. And so how do we find leaders? Largely, it's been word of mouth. We are not a brand. Reboot Recovery is not building a brand. We're creating a movement, and brands and movements work very differently. Brands typically are about promoting a certain reputation, a name, a persona. Movements are much more organic. And so because of that, if you live in Conway, Arkansas, your local leadership team of Reboot people, that is Reboot to you. They don't care who Jenny and I are. I don't want them to care who Jenny and I are. I want to fly under the radar. I'm a lot more productive when I'm not getting the credit, to be honest with you. I'm a lot better leader when I'm not worried about that. And so we identify peers who have a passion, and then we put them through a training program. And then they are assigned a coach from our staff, and that person provides ongoing coaching to make sure they have all their questions answered. And they are not becoming counselors. They are not becoming armchair quarterbacks. They are trained to facilitate the course, and only to facilitate the course. And so by doing so, we remove a lot of the fringe sort of, well, what if this comes up? What if that comes up? Because the courses are tried and true, and they're tested for things like tempo and how soon to introduce stuff and how quickly to ask these. And they're very scientific and very rigorously tested before they're rolled out to the masses. And so, so that's kind of how that process works. So it was kind of a long answer.
No, that's a great answer. Talk to me about the book that you folks have written, Healing What's Hidden. Is that kind of like an inside story, or is it? I mean, what's the book about? I haven't gotten my hands on one yet.
Well, we'll have to change that. Yeah, it's a practical guide to overcoming trauma, and will help you embrace a brighter future. So it's not a memoir. It's not a story of Jenny and I. We tell a very, very brief version. I think it's 3 pages of our story in the book. And the rest of the book is written towards people who, the book begins, I believe, I haven't actually ever read it since it came out, but I believe it says that when you open the first page, the first sentence is, you'll remember this exact moment, because this is the moment when things started to change for you. This is the moment when you began to heal. And the reason is that you chose to do something when so many other people did nothing about the pain of their past. And I think from that moment on, that's really the heartbeat of the book, is that you're going to build momentum page after page. We took, a very complex topic and divided it up into very short micro chapters that make you feel like you're moving quickly through it. And the book's done more than I ever dreamed it would, to be honest with you. We're not authors. We're not speakers. We're not influencers. Jenny and I are just people that want to build a movement. We want to be facilitators of that. And the book came about, we were at an event and had a conversation with a publisher. They said, you should hire an agent. I didn't know anything about hiring an agent. I don't know anything about that world, but I know business pretty well, and I'm pretty good at that. So I was like, I don't need an agent. I'll just create a book proposal and I'll send it into some publishing companies myself, which anybody listening will laugh at me thinking that's not the way the book industry works, because it's not the way the book industry works. And for us, we were just blown away. We had like 3 different publishers give us offers on the book from the initial
That is
thing.
odd. That is different. Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's just because we didn't write something that was speculative. I never want to create something that is built for the purpose of, I'm an influencer. I don't really know what I'm talking about, but here's some guru coaching points that might help you. I wanted more to say, more like a songwriter approach, which is what my background was. I was a musician, you might remember, and I majored in music at college. I don't know if I mentioned that here or a previous conversation I had today, but I was a musician, a songwriter. And so I felt like that's really what we do. We absorb all of this information from all these people about what's been helpful to them and what's worked and how they process things. And we take it and we distill it down and we pray over it and we kind of reconcile it with what scripture says and we reconcile it with what science says and we repackage it in a way that's beneficial then to everyone. And so I really feel like more our job is to arrange the score of the book versus it was to write the score.
Okay.
And that's, I mean, we wrote it for sure, but I would say that it's trauma survivor written, trauma survivor tested, trauma survivor approved. In terms of as people are reading it, they're going to be like, wow, Evan and Jenny must have had the world's hardest upbringing and they must have known every trauma that ever existed. And the answer is not that. It's that we have spent literally tens of thousands of hours sitting across from people, listening to them talk about their most painful experiences and how in many cases now they look back and they say, I'm not grateful that it hurt so bad, but I'm grateful that moment has become a catalyst to make me who I am today. And what a beautiful sentiment, you know?
Oh, yeah. Almost like figuring out how to integrate it into my story, but not be my story. Something like that. Is that what you are trying to say? Yeah.
Right.
So before we hit the record button, Evan, we touched a little bit on leadership, and meaning that what you were posturing was this idea that when a leader, a business owner, a ministry leader, heck, a leader of a family, a matriarch, patriarch of a family, whatever, a baseball coach who knows that one of his boys' dad or mom is whatever. And you were talking a little bit about that you guys have learned and can help leaders understand the situation and understand how to address it. And why don't we walk through that? Can we do that? Because our podcast is dominated by those that are out there leading, and I for one, haven't gone through those kinds of things in my life. And so when you haven't had that kind of experience, you got to throw up, the I don't know flag. You got to throw it up and say, I don't know what, I don't know what to do. I don't want to give the guy a pep talk. I don't want to, I don't even know what to say. I don't know what to do. What's some coaching and advice that you can give to those who may run into this, are already, it's in their circle?
Yeah. And that's probably one of my most favorite things to do, is to work with a room full of managers or leaders or pastors or lay leaders who lead small groups. Let's face it, small group leaders, you all out there, you're the first responders at our churches, right? And prayer team members, you guys are the first responders. And that's probably my favorite thing to do. We do a lot of workshops for churches, big and small. I've got one coming up with Amazon that we're doing for all their warehouse managers, and working with some other big companies. So, it's a whole workshop process that we do, but I'll try to just give you some highlights here, knowing that this isn't even the cliff notes. This is more like, I don't know, like the cliff notes, it's like not even the full cliff notes. Okay. So the first one is, let me think of the best place to start. I think maybe the first place to start would be overcoming some mind trash that really the mental health industry, unfortunately, and maybe even accidentally or inadvertently, really taught us something, especially as people in churches. It taught us something really incorrect, which is, if someone comes to you and they're suicidal or they're going through a crisis, don't say anything. Just ask them if they've talked to somebody about it, and then pass it to us. After all, we're the professionals. And that message really was very much propagated heavily through the 80s and 90s. And now we're seeing it come full bore where we've basically negated our willingness to have front porch counseling conversation. You look back before about 1983, 84, most counseling happened in the form of pastors, clergy, friends, family, priests, neighbors, right? That was who counseled us. That was where we went for counseling. And in large, suicide numbers were less, feelings of connectedness and social responsibilities were better. Right. I'm not saying, oh, everything was perfect. There was a lot of issues going on in our country at that time. My point is that the idea that, well, opening question should be, have you talked to somebody about this? Well, dummy, they're talking to you about it. Mm-hmm. You are who they're talking about it. Right. So first step, realize that in that moment, there's a grace on you. For whatever reason, they've chosen you to come to. Don't mistake that. Don't negate that grace or to be afraid of that and give way to fear. In that moment, you can start by saying, I'm not an expert in this, but I just want you to know I'm in your corner. I love you. No person will ever go wrong leading with too much grace. If you lead with too much advice, you'll go wrong 9 out of 10 times. Mm-hmm. But if you just go with curiosity, I would say the 2 key ingredients to initial conversations, curiosity and grace. When's the last time you had a truly, genuinely curious conversation with someone who was hurting that said, I don't understand what you've been through, but I want to. Help me understand. That in of itself is so healing and freeing. It allows people to organize their thoughts, to process their traumas out loud. Now they give it a clinical term, cognitive processing therapy. That's essentially what the therapist is doing, right? Or prolonged exposure. It's the idea of them telling the story so many times that they become bored with it. That's what used to happen on porches every night. Eventually you talk about the problem in your life so many times, eventually you just moved on, right?
And it validates, it validates that there is a problem. Yeah,
totally. So that's kind of step 1, lead with curiosity and grace. That's the first one. And realize you have a grace in that moment. Yeah. If you choose to step into it. The other thing is,
can I interject something?
Please.
And isn't, when you explain that, hey, just go ahead and introduce them, to the professionals. But I recall in the 90s that we were coached, I don't know by whom, but somebody, who they are, said that we have liability issues, and that you got to get licensed, and you have to have this and that, and that was a big deal back in the 90s. I mean, I knew churches that were either doing exactly what you just said, where anyone with trouble, they would literally outsource it to a professional.
Yeah,
they'd have their list of professionals. Yeah. Or if the church was big enough, they would hire a full-time
counselor. Yeah, that's still the same way it is. Nothing's changed.
Okay.
And you're going to get me a little fired up on this topic.
Let's do it.
Because when did we as the church get so busy putting on the Sunday performance that we outsourced care to the hurting and broken?
That's an ouch.
When did that happen?
Yeah.
And when did we actually think, referring to secular or even what they call Christian counselors, which is, I have tons of friends that are Christian counselors. Most of them have huge books of clients that they don't have the bandwidth for many more customers. I mean, it's just the truth. I mean, they're overworked in many cases. I think, I met with a very, fairly large church. I won't say who. I had to pause there and make sure I was being cautious. And he brought me in his office. Evan, we love Reboot, man, brother. We just love it. He said, but I got to be honest, man. I'm really nervous. I'm really concerned about the liability of us saying something and somebody goes and, takes their life. I'm concerned about the liability. And I said, it's funny. You're concerned about the liability if you say the wrong thing. I'm more concerned about the liability if you keep saying nothing. And I would say that's my message to you as leaders, especially faith leaders. Let's reclaim our place in the mantle as a place where hurting people can find actual help and compassion. Let's stop outsourcing the care of the broken, because the truth is people are coming to the lighthouse and the lighthouse is saying, sorry, lights turned off, go someplace else. We're sending our own children, our lambs, to foster parents who are only going to meet with them for 8 sessions until insurance runs out, and then they're going to be orphans again. That doesn't work.
Keep going.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so, I just think when we talk about that principle, I understand the liability concern. I do. But man, there are so many more liability things that we overlook that are way bigger risks, like sending teenagers on a trip somewhere together in a big van with 20 of them in the car somewhere. And I mean, there's huge liability risks that we take on as churches all the time. But yet the subject of mental health, somehow we've become terrified of it. Right. And do I think that people need training? Yeah. Do I think that every person in the church can be CPR trained to help somebody in cardiac arrest? Yes. I think the same is true with crisis and mental health. Every person can learn CPR. It doesn't mean you and I should be heart surgeons. We still need the experts. We still need the counselors, the clinicians. We still need that escalated path. Yeah. But when we get to a place where 1 out of every 2 people is having to go to an expert clinician or counselor, and those are people within the church, something's wrong. We shouldn't all be needing constant professional help.
Evan,
you know what I'm saying? Something's out of alignment.
No. I'm struck by something here. I'm struck by your articulation, your passion. You're either a really great actor or you are.
I can assure you that's not it.
Yeah. All right. And I work with people. I have my whole life. I'm trying to figure out, where did this passion come from? You haven't been to war, right? You haven't experienced some kind of a horrific event in your life. I think you said that. It is a bit unusual to talk to somebody who is so passionate about a topic that he hasn't experienced it organically or incarnately might be a better way to say it. Where did this come from?
Well, I think we've all experienced traumas at some level. I think that for me and my role, my goal is never to share. I don't need to. I had a great childhood. I'm one of the few people who will say that. I think in today's generation, everybody wants to have, a terrible upbringing. It's like this weird competition, race to the bottom. I had a great childhood. I had 2 parents who loved me, who loved Jesus, who raised me that way. That doesn't mean that there weren't traumas I went through.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how mine could have been better. I don't know.
And especially later on in life. Yeah. But I think for me, I don't need to share my story, because Reboot's not about me and my story, which is again the difference between a brand and a movement. I'm not trying to tell everybody my pity story and sell books. I think that where my passion comes from, and this is a bit of a cheesy answer, but have you ever met people who, they go on a mission trip to Haiti? They see it with their own eyes. They stay there for 2 weeks. They come back and they just can't shake it. So they go back again. This time they stay for a month. Yeah. And about 2 years later, guess what? They've moved them and their whole families down to Haiti. Okay.
All right. You're making sense.
And I think for me, sitting in the living room 2-3 times a week with people and seeing that their questions were not mental health related. Their questions were spiritual questions. They were questions about, why would a loving God let this person step on a pressure plate and get blown up when they had a family and they had kids, and I was a loser and a single guy and nobody would have missed me if I was gone, and yet here I am. Or, I used to go to church, but now, when I go, I just look inside and I can't feel anything. I'm numb all the time. Ever since that guy raped me, or ever since that happened, or I sat across from a young girl who, her boyfriend got high on bath salts and began to eat her, like physically bite her, and locked her up and kidnapped her. And you hear these stories, and, I'm reminded of this amazing quote from, there was a guy that I'm going to butcher it, but there was a dude who, he was hired by the United Nations after Rwanda, and he was hired to go in and try to count and assess the number of victims of the genocide that had happened there. And he was a Christian man, and he came back and he gave his report, and he was on the news on one of the BBC networks, and they said, you are a pretty outspoken Christian, and they said, when people say, where was God when this genocide was happening, he looked at the camera and he said, I've really learned that I've stopped asking where was God, and I've started asking where were God's people. And I think God has given me a unique social emotional intelligence. He's given me a wife who understands this on a scientific level. And he's given me access to a group of people that for whatever reason, they want to share about things that they've never shared with anyone else with us. And we've said, come on, talk to us about it. And dude, when you do that, people come out of the floodgates to share because nobody else cares. Nobody else listens. So it's not some supernatural skill. It's just skill of grace and listening, I think. And so that's kind of where it birthed from, I think. And the longer I've done it, the more aggressively compassionate, the more, in the paint, fighting it out under in the paint, so to speak, basketball term there that I've become.
Yeah. That's good. Diligence.
So those are some things for leaders. Let me give a couple other points for leaders real quick to circle back to that. So the first step is, I always try to ask about a person's best and worst. Tell me about the worst thing that happened this week. Tell me about the best thing that happened this week or in the last year. Tell me about in the last 12 months of your life, man. Just tell me what's the best thing that's happened. What's the worst thing that's happened? You'd be amazed how when it comes to the worst thing, people are quick to come up with 30, 40 things that they talk about. When you ask them the best, it's like people can't come up with anything. It's this weird psychological component. So in doing that, instantly, even in that question, you're actually doing healing ministry because you're reminding them that life is worth living. They're finding a best, right? And there's beauty in that. So that's a question that I always, really do. And then if you're a person who's walking with someone who's going through crisis, let me tell you one of the things that burns me out the most. A person comes up to me after I speak, hey man, I got to get together with you. Cool. We get together. He tells me about all the traumas he's been through. I give him some thoughts. We share and he says, when can we meet again? And we meet again. And you know what? He's exactly where he was the first time. Nothing's changed. And we meet again and he's exactly where he was the first time. Nothing changed. And 3 months later, 6 months later, guess what? We're still meeting. And I'm kind of like, what are we doing here? Right? Like we're not getting anywhere. And, so there's a couple things. I call it the responsibility gap, which is the gap between their willingness to take responsibility and your ability to actually help them will determine what their level of progress is. It's the gap between their willingness to take responsibility and your actual ability, And so I always kind of view it like this, is that there's two types of people that I don't want to help. And this is a little wordy here. If you had a workbook, it'd be a lot easier, but you don't. There's people who are ready, but not willing. And there's people who are willing, but not ready. I don't want to help either one of those. And let me explain the difference. Readiness relates to time. Willingness relates to attitude, right? Readiness is, hey, are you ready to go? Right? Do you have your shoes on? Every morning, my kids act like it's a shocking question that I say it's time to go to school and they need their shoes. They're always like, caught totally off guard by that every single morning. I'm like, guys, every morning is the same. But so ready, not willing, but then willing, not ready. These are people that all of us have had. They're like, oh man, I'm just so torn up from the floor up, man, brother, I'm ready to heal. And then they stand you up for the meeting. And then, oh, I'm busy at work, man, but I'm going to get into this. I'm going to get into this, man. I just, we got to go on this trip. I got a golf outing. Once the golf outing's in, brother, and those are people that are willing, but they're not ready. And so that's the first conversation I have. If you had to rate yourself on a scale of readiness and a scale of willingness, where are you at? Because if you commit to me that you're a 10 on both, I'm all in. I'll be ready and willing. But if not, I can't be more willing and ready to help you than you're ready and willing to help yourself. Or else what's going to happen is I'm going to get burned out and frustrated and I'll end up doing you harm and you'll feel like another person let you down. And I don't want to be that person.
Those examples.
That's where you can start with as a leader. Those are the three touch points that I'd recommend.
Those are strong. Those sound a lot like when you're trying to help somebody who's trying to overcome addiction.
Right.
Yeah, very
right.
Very
because how much? Also, have you ever met an addict who didn't have trauma?
Right.
Never. Never ever. So, I think that addiction is usually a symptom.
Yeah. So what are the headwinds that are you facing any headwinds right now? What are the challenges? What do you want people to know, about this ministry and the challenges that you are facing or that you see coming?
Yeah, I think we're clarifying something that is important for me. I think in order for me to stay in the game long term and feel like I can do this for a long time, is and we've been doing it a long time, but you know what I mean, a lot longer time, I should say. Is that I don't want to be involved in the world of fundraising anymore. I don't like fundraising.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I don't mind doing, because here, I don't mind meeting with philanthropic investors. And I think there's a difference between fundraising and philanthropic investing. Fundraising basically says, Evan, tell us the saddest, most sort of emotionally charged story that hopefully will compel me enough or take me on a tour or a trip to let me try to get a tearjerker where I'm going to make a big, passionate gift. I don't want to really do that. Instead, I want to work with philanthropic investors. Investors look at the need. They look at the ROI. They look at the leadership team. They look at the track record of the growth on that investment. They look at how long it's going to take to get their return. They look at all these factors, and then they invest both with their head and their heart. And I think for us, we need more philanthropic investors. We do all of this. It's not a secret. We do all of this on about a $2.2 million budget a year. And we've had over 20,000 people so far this year, 2,400 people. We've got about 1,400 volunteers that facilitate courses on a weekly basis. And our staff works their absolute rear ends off. Okay. So, and I'm just saying, we hire top-notch, top-shelf people. We're not trying to hire the cheap person who's just sold out, because from me, we hire good quality people who know how to execute at a high level, because we're dealing with life and death stuff and we can't take any chances. But we need, our largest investor is 3% of our total giving. We've yet to have somebody come along and say, you know what? Here's a 6-figure investment in what you're doing. And I know there's people listening here who have been encouraged by what I've shared, and maybe one of them wants to contact me. So that's number one. Number two, we'd love to come in and equip more businesses and more churches. Our churches, if you're a pastor or a church leader and you don't have a key piece of your strategy focused on mental health or trauma, I believe you run the risk of missing out on the greatest evangelical opportunity maybe our generation will ever see. Just simple things. 1 out of every 5 kids, more than 22% of kids under the age of 18 identify as LGBTQ. 1 out of 5, 20%. That population statistically has extreme risks of suicide, extreme risks of mental health challenges, et cetera, et cetera. You look at, whatever, I'm not going to bore you with the data. The point is that churches who want to keep growing need to have a really strong strategy for mental health. And I can't believe that the best that we can do is say we hire a pastoral counselor, we send everybody to them for triage, they do one appointment with them, and then they outsource them to a counselor. I can't believe that's the best we can do. I think that's a piece of the strategy. I think it's brilliant. It's wonderful. I just can't believe that's the totality of it. We have to do more than that. And we want to equip churches to do that. And the third thing is, I think for us, the headwinds are, trying to think of the right way to sort of present this. The work that we do is very dark. And I believe that the Lord often is taking us to do work in some of the most challenging places in the world. And bluntly speaking, there are open doors right now that we just can't walk through yet, because we don't have the manpower. We don't have the prayer support. We don't feel like we could go into, some of these places I'm not going to go to, but these are very, very, very dark places. And we want to go there, we want to do that, but we need people to stand with us in prayer. We need people to step forward and say, what do you need? How can I help? And there's about 80,000 ways. Some of them aren't even financial. A lot of them are connecting us with certain people who can help us with access to various entities and governments and world leaders and state controlled things and child protective services departments. And there's so many different places where we have open doors right now, but a lot of that, there's a lot of political clout you have to be able to stay.
Yeah.
And we need those people in our corner.
Evan, this has been enlightening. It's also been encouraging what you're doing, and I think the listeners will get us positive feedback. Again, it's REBOOT rebootrecovery.com to learn more about it. The website is very informative, very easy to get around in. You can learn a lot, and I'm going to be tracking you. I'm going to be following you and seeing how things are going. I just want to say thank you for taking the time, Evan, getting on this podcast. We're going to be the better for it.
Thank you, man. This was great. This was fun. Thank you. Good questions too, by the way. So thank you.